There's a feeling that millions of people carry every single day, but almost none of them can name it. It's not depression, it's not anxiety, it's not burnout, although it gets misdiagnosed as all three. It's the quiet, persistent sense that the life you're living isn't the life that was meant for you. Not because anything is technically wrong. You might have the career, the relationship, the apartment, the routine. On paper, it works. But somewhere beneath the surface, in a place you can't quite reach, something is missing, something essential, something that no promotion, no vacation, no new relationship has ever been able to fill. And here's what makes it worse. You can't explain it to anyone, because the moment you try, they look at you like you're ungrateful, like you should be happy with what you have, like something is wrong with you for wanting more. Not more stuff, not more success, but more realness, more alignment between who you are on the outside and whoever is buried on the inside. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists who ever lived, spent his entire career trying to understand that feeling. Not to cure it, not to medicate it away, but to follow it. Because he believed that feeling, that unnamed ache, is not a malfunction, it's a signal that you are being called toward the most important psychological transformation a human being can undergo. He called it individuation, and what you're about to learn over the next hour will fundamentally change how you understand yourself, your relationships, your suffering, and your purpose. But I need to be honest with you before we begin. This is not a comfortable video. This is not 5 tips for a better mindset. What Jung mapped is a descent, a full confrontation with every part of yourself you've been trained to hide, deny, and suppress. And by the end of it, you'll understand why most people never complete this process. Not because they can't, because they won't. You're still here. So let's find out which one you are. Before we dive in, I want to give you a clear picture of where we're going, because this isn't a random collection of ideas. This is a structured journey, and the order matters. Over the next 8 modules, we're going to walk through the entire process of Jungian individuation, step by step, layer by layer, from the surface of your psychology all the way down to its center. Here's the map. We'll start with the persona, the mask you built to survive the world, the version of you that everyone knows, the version that might not be you at all. Then we'll go beneath the mask and meet the shadow, every part of yourself that was exiled, rejected, and pushed into the dark. This is the module that will hit the hardest, and it's the one most people spend their entire lives avoiding. After that, we'll explore the Anima and Animus, the hidden inner figure that's been silently shaping every romantic relationship you've ever had. Then we reach the self, the center of the psyche, the thing you've been circling your whole life without knowing it. From there, we enter the night sea journey, what the process of individuation actually feels like when you're living through it. Not theory, not abstraction. The raw, disorienting, sometimes terrifying experience of psychological transformation. And finally, integration. What it looks like on the other side. How you live, how you love, and how you move through the world as a whole human being instead of a fragmented one. Each module builds on the one before it. If you skip ahead, you'll miss the foundation. So I'd encourage you to treat this like an actual course. Watch it in order, take your time, and if something hits you in a way you didn't expect, pause. Sit with it. That's not a sign to stop. That's a sign you've reached the layer that needs your attention. Timestamps are in the description if you need to come back to a specific section. Now, let's begin where Jung always began. Not with the unconscious, not with dreams or archetypes, but with something much closer to the surface. Something you interact with every single day. Something so familiar that you've probably mistaken it for who you actually are. Jung noticed something strange about the patients who came to see him. They weren't all traumatized. They weren't all mentally ill in any clinical sense. Many of them were successful, educated, functioning. Some of them were the most accomplished people in their communities, doctors, lawyers, artists, business owners, and yet they sat across from him with the same expression, the same hollowness behind the eyes. the same quiet confession that eventually came out, usually after weeks of avoiding it. I don't know who I am. Not, I'm sad. Not, I'm broken. Just, I built this life and now I'm standing inside it, and I don't recognize myself. Jung didn't treat this as a disorder. He treated it as an arrival, because in his framework, this moment, this confrontation with inner emptiness, is not the beginning of a breakdown. It is the beginning of the real work. He saw it again and again, particularly in people in the second half of life, the mid-30s, the 40s, the 50s, people who had spent decades climbing a ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. But here's what most people miss about Jung's observations. He wasn't saying these people made bad choices. He was saying they made other people's choices, their parents' choices, society's choices, the choices their culture rewarded and their fear demanded. They built a life based on what they were told would make them whole, and then they arrived at the destination and found nothing. Not nothing as in emptiness, nothing as in the thing they were searching for was never out here in the first place. That realization is the call, and you need to understand, the call is not a gentle invitation, it's a disruption. It arrives as restlessness, as insomnia, as the strange inability to enjoy things that used to satisfy you, as an irritation with conversations that feel shallow, even though they're the same conversations you've been having for years. Sometimes it arrives as a crisis, a divorce, a death, a job loss, an illness that strips away the structures you were hiding behind. But sometimes, and this is the version nobody talks about, it arrives as absolutely nothing. No crisis, no trauma, no dramatic event, just a slow, creeping awareness that the mask you've been wearing has started to suffocate you, and you can't take it off because you don't remember what's underneath. That mask, the one you built so carefully, so unconsciously, over so many years, is what Jung called the persona, and it's the first thing we need to dismantle. But before we do that in the next module, I need you to understand something about why the mask was built in the first place. Because if you don't understand its origins, you'll either cling to it out of fear or rip it off out of anger. And neither of those leads to individuation. Both lead to a different kind of suffering. You were not born wearing a mask. That much is obvious. But what's less obvious is how early the mask building begins. Jung understood, and developmental psychology has since confirmed, that the construction of the false self begins in the first years of life, before you had language, before you had conscious memory, before you had any framework for understanding what was happening to you. Here's how it works, and once you see this, you cannot unsee it. As a child, you expressed yourself naturally, fully, without filter. You cried when you were hurt. You laughed when you were happy. You raged when you were frustrated. You were curious about things that interested you and indifferent to things that didn't. And the world responded, not always with cruelty, not always with punishment, sometimes with something far more subtle and far more damaging, conditional approval. You learned, not through instruction, but through thousands of micro-interactions, which parts of you were welcome and which parts of you were not. You learned that being quiet got approval, or that being loud got attention. You learned that crying made your father uncomfortable, that anger made your mother withdraw, that achievement made everyone smile, that sadness made people tell you to stop. And so, piece by piece, without any conscious decision, you began to edit yourself. You began to amplify the traits that were rewarded and suppress the traits that were punished. The helpful child, the smart child, the funny child, the tough child, the easy child. Not who you were, who you needed to be in order to maintain connection, in order to survive. Because to a child, connection is survival. Losing the love of your caregiver is not an inconvenience. It is, to the developing psyche, a matter of life and death. So you adapted, brilliantly, instinctively, completely. And the version of you that emerged from that adaptation, the curated, edited, socially optimized version, is what Jung called the persona. The word literally comes from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. You've been performing ever since. The tragedy isn't that you built the mask. You had no choice. The tragedy is that you built it so young and wore it so long that you eventually forgot it was a mask at all. And that forgetting, that fusion of identity with performance, is the first thing individuation asks you to undo. So let's return to that feeling we started with, that unnamed ache, that persistent sense that something is missing. Now you have context for it. What's missing is you, not the curated version, not the performing version, not the version that knows exactly what to say and how to say it and which emotions are acceptable to show in which settings. The actual you, the one that got buried under decades of adaptation. And here's why this feeling, as uncomfortable as it is actually the best news you could receive. Because it means the buried self is still alive. It means that despite everything, despite the conditioning, the suppression, the years of living someone else's blueprint, the part of you that is authentic, original, and irreducibly yours has not been destroyed. It's been muffled. It's been exiled. But it's still sending signals. That restlessness? Signal. That feeling of being a stranger in your own life? Signal. The dreams that unsettle you, the emotions that don't match the situation, the sudden inexplicable urge to walk away from everything you've built. Signals, all of them. Jung would say the self, the deepest center of your psyche, is trying to get the ego's attention. It's been trying for a long time. And the fact that you're feeling the ache means it's getting louder. Most people hear this signal and try to silence it. They change jobs, they change partners, they buy something, they move somewhere. They redecorate the prison instead of questioning why they're in one. But some people, and I suspect you're one of them or you wouldn't still be watching, hear the signal and do something far more terrifying. They turn toward it. They stop rearranging the furniture and start looking at the walls. They stop asking, "What should I do with my life?" and start asking a much more dangerous question. Who am I, actually, beneath everything I was told to be? That question is the threshold of individuation. And once you ask it sincerely, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a lived, urgent, deeply personal inquiry, there is no going back. The mask has been seen. And a mask that has been seen can never be worn the same way again. Before we move into Module 2, I want to make sure you understand what individuation actually is, because the modern world has distorted it into something Jung would barely recognize. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not about becoming a better, shinier, more optimized version of yourself. That's just building a better persona. It is not finding yourself in the way Instagram means it, traveling to Bali, journaling in a cafe, curating an aesthetic that signals depth. It is not therapy in the traditional sense, although therapy can support the process, and it is absolutely not comfortable. Here is what it is. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole by integrating the unconscious parts of the psyche into conscious awareness. In plain language, it is the slow, painful, sacred work of meeting every part of yourself you were taught to reject. Your darkness, your power, your grief, your hunger, your softness, your fury, and instead of exiling them, reclaiming them, bringing them home, giving them a seat at the table of your identity. It is the process of moving from a life dictated by the unconscious, by patterns you can't see, wounds you haven't named, and roles you never chose, to a life directed by conscious wholeness. Jung didn't promise it would make you happy. He promised it would make you real. And he believed, based on decades of clinical work and his own harrowing personal experience, that it is the single most important thing a human being can do, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. Because an unconscious person doesn't just suffer quietly. They spread their unconsciousness through projection, through reactivity, through the unexamined patterns they inflict on their children, their partners, their communities. The unconscious person doesn't just carry their shadow, they cast it onto the world. Individuation is how you stop doing that. It is how you take responsibility, not for what happened to you, but for what lives inside you now. And it begins, as we'll see in the next module, with looking directly at the mask you've been wearing your whole life and asking the question that changes everything. If this isn't me, then who is? That's Module 2, the persona. and it's where we go next. In the last module, we named the feeling, that quiet sense that the life you're living doesn't belong to you, and we traced it back to its origin, the moment in childhood when you stopped being who you were and started being who you needed to be. Now we go deeper, because the mask you built in childhood didn't stay a childhood survival strategy. It grew with you. It refined itself. It became more sophisticated, more convincing, more airtight, until it wasn't just something you wore. It became something you were, or at least something you believed you were. This module is about the persona, and by the end of it, you'll start to see the outlines of a mask you didn't know you were wearing. That recognition, quiet, subtle, possibly uncomfortable, is the first real crack in the architecture of your false self, and individuation begins in that crack. The word persona comes from ancient Latin. It referred to the large, exaggerated masks that actors wore on stage in Roman and Greek theater. The mask told the audience who the character was, the hero, the villain, the wise elder, the fool. The actor's real face was irrelevant. What mattered was the mask. Jung chose this word very deliberately. He used it to describe the social face that every human being constructs, the curated presentation of self that you show to the world. Your persona is the version of you that walks into a job interview, the version that meets your partner's parents for the first time, the version that posts on social media, the version that answers the question, "How are you?" with, "Good, thanks," regardless of what's actually happening inside. Now, on the surface, this sounds simple, obvious even. Of course, we present different versions of ourselves in different contexts. That's just social intelligence. But Jung wasn't talking about social intelligence. He was talking about something far more dangerous. He was talking about what happens when the performance becomes permanent, when the gap between who you present and who you actually are grows so wide and has existed for so long that you lose access to the person behind the mask entirely. That's not social skill. That's psychological imprisonment. And the prison is so well constructed that most of the inmates don't even know they're locked up. Let me show you what I mean. Think about the last time someone asked you what you wanted. Not what you wanted for dinner, what you wanted from your life, what you wanted from a relationship. What kind of work would actually make you feel alive? If your honest answer was some version of, "I don't know," that's not a lack of ambition. That's the persona doing its job. Because the persona's function isn't just to show the world an acceptable version of you. Its deeper function is to keep the unacceptable version hidden, including from yourself. You can't want what you're not allowed to want. You can't feel what you were punished for feeling. You can't choose authentically when the choosing mechanism itself has been outsourced to a mask that was designed to prioritize survival over truth. And so you end up in the strangest kind of prison, one where you're both the prisoner and the guard, and you built the walls yourself, and you can't remember doing it. That's the persona. Here's something important to understand. You don't have one persona. You have several, and they activate depending on context. There's the persona you wear at work, competent, measured, professional, maybe slightly detached, maybe slightly warmer than you actually feel, whatever the environment rewards. There's the persona you wear with your family, perhaps the responsible one, the peacekeeper, the achiever, the black sheep. A role that was assigned to you before you were old enough to refuse it. There's the persona you wear in romantic relationships, the version of you that knows what your partner needs to see, attentive or independent or easygoing or strong. Not because you chose those qualities, but because you learned, through trial and error, which version of you gets loved and which version gets left. There's the persona you wear with strangers, polished, pleasant, unremarkable, designed to get through the interaction without exposure, without being truly seen. And then there's the persona you wear when you're alone. And this is the one that should concern you the most, because for many people, and if you're deep into persona identification, this will be hard to hear. The mask doesn't come off even in solitude. The performance continues when no one is watching. You scroll through your phone to avoid silence. You narrate your own life internally as if someone is observing. You rehearse conversations. You construct opinions based on what sounds intelligent rather than what you actually think. The persona has colonized your inner world, and when that happens, you've reached a stage that Jung considered genuinely perilous, because you're no longer performing for someone, you're performing for no one. The mask has fused with the face, and the real face, your actual thoughts, your actual feelings, your actual desires, has been offline for so long that you're not sure it still exists. This is what Jung meant when he warned about identification with the persona. It's not that having a social mask is a problem. We all need one. Jung was clear about that. The persona is necessary. It allows us to navigate social reality. It protects the inner self from being exposed in contexts where exposure would be unsafe. The problem is when the mask becomes the identity, when there's no longer a person behind the performance, or at least no person you have access to. And this is where things get really interesting. Because persona identification doesn't just affect how you present yourself, it affects how you think, how you feel, what you're capable of perceiving. Let me explain. When the persona is running your life, there are specific psychological symptoms that show up, and most people have no idea these symptoms are connected to the mask. They think they're just personality traits, or normal adult life, or how things are. They're not. The first cost is chronic exhaustion that rest doesn't fix. Not physical exhaustion, although it often manifests physically. This is the exhaustion of maintaining a performance 24 hours a day. The energy required to constantly monitor how you're being perceived, to adjust your behavior to match expectations, to suppress the impulses and emotions that don't fit the role. That energy has to come from somewhere, and it comes from you, from your vitality, from the life force that should be available for creativity, for joy, for genuine connection. This is why so many people describe feeling tired all the time despite sleeping 8 hours. The body is resting, but the psyche never stops performing. The second cost is a creeping sense of fraudulence. This gets mislabeled as imposter syndrome, as if it's a confidence problem. It's not. The feeling of being a fraud is accurate, not because you're incompetent, but because on some level, you know that the person receiving the praise, the love, the recognition, isn't really you. It's the persona. And if anyone ever saw behind the mask, really saw you, you're terrified they would leave. That terror keeps the mask in place more effectively than any external pressure ever could. The third cost is the inability to access genuine emotion. People deep in persona identification often describe their emotional life as flat, muted. They can perform emotion, they can say the right things, make the right faces, but internally, the signal is weak. Happiness feels like a concept rather than an experience. Sadness gets intellectualized rather than felt. Anger gets suppressed until it explodes in ways that seem disproportionate and confusing. This isn't emotional dysfunction. This is the persona doing what it was designed to do, regulating which emotions are allowed to surface and which must remain buried. The problem is that you can't selectively numb. When you suppress grief, you suppress joy along with it. When you block anger, you block passion. The persona's censorship is indiscriminate, and over time, it doesn't just mute specific emotions, it mutes the entire inner world. The fourth cost, and this is the one Jung considered the most significant, is the loss of contact with the unconscious. The persona operates as a kind of seal between your conscious awareness and the deeper layers of the psyche. When the seal is too tight, when the persona has become rigid and total, the unconscious can't communicate with you through its normal channels. Dreams become vague or forgotten. Intuitions get overridden by logic. Synchronicities go unnoticed. The subtle signals that your deeper self is constantly sending, signals about your true path, your real needs, your actual identity, get blocked at the gate. And without those signals, you're navigating your life using a map that was drawn by other people. A map of expectations, obligations, and inherited values that may have nothing to do with who you actually are. You're lost. But you don't know you're lost, because the persona keeps telling you you're exactly where you should be. That is the deepest cost of the mask. Now, if you're starting to see your own persona, your first instinct might be to tear it down. Burn it. Declare to the world, "This isn't who I am," and start over from scratch. Jung would caution you, strongly, against this. Because the persona, as restrictive as it is, serves a vital protective function. And removing it without having something to replace it with doesn't lead to authenticity. It leads to psychological exposure that the psyche is not prepared for. Think about it this way. The persona is like the walls of a house. Yes, walls restrict your movement. Yes, they block your view. But they also protect you from the elements. If you tear down the walls before you've built a new structure, or before you've strengthened the inner self enough to withstand exposure, you don't get freedom, you get chaos. Jung saw this in patients who attempted to dismantle their persona too quickly. They would have what looked like a breakthrough, quitting their job, ending relationships, publicly rejecting their former identity, and then collapse. Because they hadn't done the deeper work of building a relationship with the parts of themselves that the persona was hiding. They didn't know who they were without the mask. And that vacuum, that sudden absence of identity, is terrifying. It can trigger anxiety, depression, dissociation, and in extreme cases what Jung called psychic inflation, where the ego, unmoored from its social identity, latches onto an archetype and begins identifying with it. The person who destroys their corporate persona and suddenly believes they're a shaman. The person who drops their nice persona and becomes consumed by their anger. Not integration, possession. This is why individuation is a process, not an event. The persona isn't demolished, it's seen through, made transparent. You don't destroy the mask, you develop the ability to pick it up and put it down consciously, to wear it when it serves you and remove it when it doesn't, to know, at all times, that the mask is a mask, and that the one wearing it is someone deeper. That ability, the ability to hold the persona lightly, to relate to it as a tool rather than an identity, only becomes possible when you've begun to make contact with what lives beneath it. And what lives beneath it is everything you were told couldn't exist. Despite everything I've just said about not forcing the process, the truth is, for many people, the persona begins to crack on its own. Not because they chose to dismantle it, but because life forced the issue. The cracks appear in predictable places. The first crack is usually a relationship that collapses, not because of external betrayal, but because one person began to change, and the relationship couldn't accommodate the shift. You outgrow the dynamic. The role you were playing no longer fits, and the person who loved the persona doesn't recognize, or doesn't want, the person emerging behind it. The second crack is often a body that rebels. Chronic illness, mysterious pain, fatigue that has no medical explanation. The body, in Jung's framework, is closely connected to the unconscious. When the psyche's messages are blocked from reaching consciousness through normal channels, they route through the body instead. Your symptoms are not random. They are the unconscious knocking on the only door you haven't locked. The third crack is a meaning crisis. The goals that once motivated you stop working. The career that once felt important feels hollow. You look at the trajectory of your life and feel not excited, not afraid, just indifferent. And that indifference scares you more than failure ever did, because at least failure meant you cared about something. The fourth crack is the return of the repressed. Emotions you haven't felt in years, or have never allowed yourself to feel, begin to surface. Sometimes as panic attacks, sometimes as sudden weeping, sometimes as rage that seems to come from nowhere and attach itself to everything. The persona's censorship is failing. The exiled parts are pushing through. When these cracks appear, and if you're watching this video, there's a good chance at least one of them already has. You are standing at a threshold. Behind you is the known world, the mask, the performance, the life that makes sense to everyone except the one living it. In front of you is the unknown. And the first thing waiting for you in that unknown is the part of yourself that has been living in exile for as long as you can remember. Jung called it the shadow, and it has been waiting for this moment. You've seen the mask now. You know it's there. You might even be starting to feel the edges of it, the places where the performance ends and something rawer begins. But here's what I need to prepare you for. What lives behind the mask is not what you expect. It's not some radiant, fully formed, true self waiting to embrace you the moment you look inward. That's the fantasy. The reality is messier, darker, more confronting than any external challenge you've ever faced. Because the first thing you encounter when you look behind the persona, the very first thing, is not the self. It's the shadow. And the shadow is everything about you that you've spent your entire life pretending doesn't exist. This is the module that will hit hardest. Not because the ideas are complicated, they're not, but because if you're honest with yourself while you listen, you'll start to recognize things about your own psychology that you've never allowed yourself to see. That recognition is the beginning of shadow work, and shadow work is the foundation of everything that comes after. There is no individuation without this. There is no wholeness without this. There is no shortcut around it, only through. Let's start by clearing away the most common misconception, because it's the one that stops most people before they even begin. The shadow is not your dark side. That phrase, your dark side, implies that the shadow is made of evil, that it contains the worst parts of you, that it's a monster crouching in the basement of your psyche, waiting to take over if you give it any attention. That is not what Jung described, not even close. Here's what the shadow actually is. The shadow is the container for every part of your personality that was rejected during the formation of your persona. That's it. It's not a moral category, it's a psychological category. It holds whatever was exiled, and what was exiled depends entirely on what your specific environment punished. This means the contents of the shadow are different for everyone. If you grew up in a household where anger was forbidden, where raised voices meant danger, where conflict was met with silence or withdrawal, then your anger is in the shadow. Not because anger is dark, because it was made dark for you. It was pushed underground, made into something shameful, something that good people don't feel. But here's what most people never consider. If you grew up in a household where vulnerability was punished, where crying was met with ridicule, where softness was treated as weakness, then your tenderness is in the shadow. Your grief, your need for comfort, your capacity for gentleness. These aren't dark qualities, they're beautiful qualities, but they were exiled all the same. If you grew up in a family that distrusted ambition, where wanting too much was seen as selfish, where standing out was discouraged, then your drive, your hunger for excellence, your desire to be seen and recognized, all of that went into the shadow. If you were raised to be responsible, reliable, the one everyone depends on, then your playfulness is in the shadow. Your spontaneity, your capacity for recklessness and joy, and doing something for no productive reason at all. Do you see what this means? The shadow is not a collection of sins. The shadow is a collection of amputations. It holds every limb of your personality that was cut off so the persona could fit into the shape the world demanded. And this is why Jung made a statement that, on first reading, sounds almost absurd. He said, "The shadow is 90% pure gold. Not 90% darkness, 90% gold. Your greatest strengths, your most authentic impulses, your unlived life, the life you would have lived if no one had told you who to be, all of it, sitting in the shadow, waiting, not to destroy you, to complete you." Now, here's where it gets uncomfortable, because the shadow doesn't just sit quietly in the dark. The shadow is active. It's operating in your life every single day, shaping your decisions, distorting your perceptions, sabotaging your relationships. And it does all of this without your conscious knowledge. Jung put it more bluntly than almost anyone in the history of psychology. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's not a metaphor. That's a clinical observation. And the shadow has 4 primary mechanisms through which it runs your life from behind the curtain. The first mechanism is projection. This is the big one. The one that, once you truly understand it, will change how you see every relationship you've ever had. Projection works like this. Whatever you refuse to acknowledge in yourself, you will see, with exaggerated clarity and disproportionate emotional intensity, in other people. That coworker who irritates you beyond reason, the one who is arrogant, self-centered, always demanding attention, ask yourself something. Is your reaction proportional to what they're actually doing, or is something else happening? Jung would say, the intensity of your reaction is the signature of the shadow. You're not just seeing their arrogance, You're seeing your own disowned hunger for recognition, the ambition you were taught to suppress, reflected back at you in a form you can safely judge without having to own it yourself. This is why you can meet someone for 30 seconds and feel an immediate, visceral dislike. Not because you know anything about them, but because they are carrying something visibly that you have been carrying invisibly, and the contrast is unbearable. Projection is the shadow's favorite game, and it's playing it in every area of your life. The qualities you judge most harshly in others are, without exception, the qualities you have disowned in yourself. Not always in the same form, not always in the same intensity, but the emotional charge is the giveaway. If it triggers you, it's yours. That is a difficult truth to sit with. Take a moment if you need one. The second mechanism is self-sabotage. Have you ever been on the verge of something good? A promotion, a new relationship, a creative project, a moment of genuine happiness, and then watched yourself destroy it? Not through bad luck, through your own behavior, procrastination, picking a fight, withdrawing, making a choice so obviously self-defeating that even you couldn't explain it afterward. That's the shadow. Not because the shadow is trying to punish you, but because the shadow holds the parts of you that believe you don't deserve what the persona is reaching for. If your shadow contains the message, "You are not worthy of love," planted there by a childhood experience you may not even consciously remember, then every time love gets close, the shadow will intervene. It will manufacture a reason to pull away. It will create the very rejection it was trying to prevent. Self-sabotage is not a character flaw. It is the unconscious acting out a script that was written decades ago, in a language you were never taught to read. The third mechanism is emotional flooding. This is what happens when the persona's defenses are temporarily overwhelmed, when the shadow breaks through the surface in raw, unfiltered form. Sudden rage that seems to come from nowhere. Grief that hits you in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Panic that strikes without any identifiable threat. Jealousy so intense it shocks you. Shame so deep it immobilizes you. These aren't malfunctions of the nervous system. These are eruptions from the shadow. Emotions that have been compressed under enormous pressure for years, sometimes decades, finally finding a crack in the wall. And here's the part that makes this so confusing. The trigger is almost never proportional to the response. Someone makes an offhand comment and you feel murderous. A friend cancels plans and you feel abandoned on an existential level. A stranger succeeds and you feel a wave of bitterness that makes you question your own character. The trigger is present tense. The emotion is ancient. You're not reacting to now, you're reacting to then. And then is stored in the shadow, fully charged, fully intact, ready to detonate whenever the current moment rhymes with the original wound. The fourth mechanism is repetition compulsion. This is perhaps the most insidious of all, because it disguises itself as fate. Repetition compulsion is the unconscious tendency to recreate the same painful dynamics over and over again. The same type of unavailable partner, the same kind of toxic workplace, the same pattern of getting close to someone and then feeling betrayed, the same cycle of hope, disappointment, and withdrawal. You look at your life and you think, why does this keep happening to me? Jung's answer, it keeps happening through you, not to you. The shadow doesn't attract these situations because it's malicious. It attracts them because it's trying to heal. It recreates the original wound, the dynamic from childhood, the pattern from the formative relationship, and places you inside it again, not to punish you, to give you another chance to see it, to respond differently, to finally make the unconscious conscious. But if you don't see it, if you remain identified with the persona and refuse to look at the shadow, you just live the pattern on repeat, and you call it bad luck, or poor judgment, or that's just how relationships are. It's not. It's the shadow, running the show from a room you've never entered. At this point, something in you might be resisting. That resistance is not a problem. It's actually important information, because the resistance you feel toward looking at your shadow is the same resistance that has kept it in the dark your entire life. It's the persona's immune system activating, the part of your psyche that says, don't look there, it's not safe, you won't survive what you find. And that fear is not irrational, it's outdated. When you were a child, Looking at the exiled parts of yourself genuinely wasn't safe. Expressing anger when anger was punished could cost you connection. Showing vulnerability when vulnerability was mocked could cost you protection. The decision to exile those parts was a survival decision, a brilliant one. You should not judge the child who made it, but you are not that child anymore. And the survival strategy that saved you at 7 is strangling you at 37. The wall that protected you in a dangerous household is now a prison in an adult life where you have resources, autonomy, and choices that the child never had. The shadow work you've been avoiding isn't dangerous because of what you'll find. It's dangerous only if you never do it. Because the shadow doesn't weaken with neglect. It strengthens. It accumulates charge. Every year you refuse to look at it, it gains more influence over your behavior, your relationships, and your inner life. Jung was unambiguous about this. He said that the shadow, when repressed, doesn't just persist, it grows. And what could have been integrated with moderate effort at 30 becomes a crisis at 50. What could have been a difficult conversation with yourself becomes a full psychological breakdown. The shadow is patient, but it is not passive, and it will have its moment, one way or another. You can meet it on your terms, with awareness, with courage, with the willingness to feel what you've been running from. Or you can wait until it breaks down the door on its own. One of those paths is individuation. The other is what most people experience as a midlife crisis, a nervous breakdown, or a life that simply, quietly, undramatically, fails to become what it was meant to be. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. All right, enough theory. Let's talk about what to actually do. Shadow work is not a single technique. It's an ongoing practice, a way of relating to yourself that prioritizes honesty over comfort. But there are specific methods that Jung used and that have been refined in the centuries since his work. I'm going to give you 5 of them, not all at once. Pick the one that resonates most and start there. Method 1. The trigger map. For the next 2 weeks, pay close attention to your strongest emotional reactions, particularly the ones that feel disproportionate to the situation. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you feel fury. A friend gets a promotion and you feel a sting of resentment. Someone at a dinner party is loud and opinionated and you feel intense disdain. Write these down. Every single one. Date, situation, emotion, and intensity on a scale of 1 to 10. After 2 weeks, look at the list. You will see patterns, recurring themes, the same emotional signatures appearing again and again in different contexts. Those patterns are your shadow's fingerprints. Each one is a doorway to exiled material. You don't need to do anything with them yet, just see them. Awareness is the first act of integration. Method 2. The projection inventory. Make a list of the qualities you most despise in other people. Not mildly dislike, despise. The traits that make your skin crawl, that make you judgmental in a way that feels righteous and absolute. Arrogance, selfishness, neediness, weakness, dishonesty, laziness, whatever your personal list contains. Now, and this is the hard part, ask yourself, where does this quality live in me? Not in the same form necessarily, not to the same degree, but where is the seed of this trait in my own psyche? If you cannot find it, if your immediate reaction is, that's not me at all, you've found the shadow. Because the more emphatically you deny a quality, the more likely it is to be deeply repressed. This is not about self-blame. This is about self-honesty. And the difference between the two is everything. Method 3. The body scan. The shadow doesn't just live in the mind, it lives in the body. Tension in the jaw, tightness in the chest, a knot in the stomach that appears in specific situations and disappears in others. When you notice a physical sensation that seems connected to an emotional response, pause. Don't analyze it. Don't try to make it go away. Just stay with it. Breathe into it. And ask, not with your intellect, but with your attention, what are you holding? Sometimes the body will answer, not in words, in images, in memories, in sudden waves of emotion that don't seem to connect to the present moment. That's shadow material surfacing through the body's intelligence. Let it come. Method 4. Dream attention. Jung considered dreams to be the royal road to the shadow, even more direct than waking analysis. The shadow often appears in dreams as a figure of the same gender as the dreamer, someone threatening, someone you're running from, someone who disturbs you, someone who behaves in ways the waking persona would never allow. Start keeping a dream journal. Write in it immediately upon waking, even fragments. Don't interpret, just record. Over time, patterns will emerge. Recurring figures, recurring settings, recurring emotions. These are not random. They are communications from the unconscious. And the figures that frighten you most in your dreams are very often the shadow, showing you, in the only language it has, the parts of yourself that are asking to be seen. Method 5. The 3-2-1 process. This one is structured enough to use in a single sitting. Step 1. See it. Choose a person or a quality that triggers you. Describe them in third person. He is controlling. He always needs to be right. He makes everything about himself. Step 2. Feel it. Shift to second person. Talk to this quality directly. You are always trying to control things. You can't let go. You need everything to go your way. Step 3. Be it. Shift to first person. Own it. I am controlling. I need to be right. I make things about myself. Notice what happens in your body when you say those words. The resistance, the discomfort, the heat, and, if you stay with it, the strange, quiet relief that comes from finally telling the truth. That relief is integration beginning. I told you earlier that Jung said the shadow is 90% gold. Let me explain what that means in practical, lived experience, because this is the part that makes the pain of shadow work worth it. When you integrate a piece of your shadow, you don't just resolve a psychological wound. You reclaim energy. Think about it. Every piece of yourself that lives in exile requires energy to keep exiled. Repression is not passive. It's an active process. Your psyche is working around the clock, using enormous resources to keep the shadow material below the surface, to prevent it from reaching consciousness, to maintain the persona's clean, edited version of who you are. When you integrate shadow material, when you bring it into conscious awareness and accept it as part of yourself, the energy that was being used for repression is suddenly released. It becomes available, and that energy shows up in your life in ways that feel almost miraculous. Creativity that was blocked for years suddenly flows. Not because you learned a new technique, because the creative impulse was in the shadow, locked up alongside the parts of you that were too wild, too strange, too original for the persona to accommodate. Confidence that felt performative suddenly becomes real, not because you developed a better persona, because the self-doubt was a symptom of internal division. When the shadow is integrated, the division heals, and confidence becomes a natural byproduct of being whole rather than fragmented. Relationships that were stuck in repetitive patterns suddenly shift, not because the other person changed, because you stopped projecting. You stopped seeing your own exiled material in their face, and when the projection drops, you see the actual person in front of you, maybe for the first time. Emotional range expands dramatically. You don't just feel happy or fine. You feel the full spectrum: grief, fury, tenderness, ecstasy, longing, amusement, awe, without the persona's censorship reducing everything to a flat line. And here's the one that surprises people most. Physical energy returns. The chronic fatigue that no doctor could explain, the heaviness, the lethargy, the sense that everything takes more effort than it should, begins to lift. Because the body is no longer bearing the weight of everything the mind refused to carry. This is what Jung meant by gold. Your power is not somewhere outside you. It's not in a promotion or a relationship or a spiritual experience. It's in the shadow. It's in the very qualities you were taught to fear. And bringing them home, into the light of conscious awareness, is the most transformative act of self-recovery a human being can perform. The shadow is the first and most essential confrontation of individuation. And if you've been honest with yourself during this module, if you've felt the resistance, felt the recognition, felt the edges of something you've been carrying without knowing it, then you've already begun the work. But the shadow is not the only hidden figure in the unconscious. There is another, one that Jung considered equally powerful, equally hidden, and in many ways even more mysterious. It doesn't operate through projection and self-sabotage the way the shadow does. It operates through attraction, through longing, through the ache you feel when you look at another person and think, "You are the missing piece of me." Jung called it the Anima and the Animus, and it has been quietly orchestrating every intimate relationship you've ever had. That's Module 4. The shadow showed you the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. It operated through repulsion, through the things you judge, the patterns you repeat, the emotions that ambush you from the dark. But there's another figure in the unconscious, one that doesn't push you away, one that pulls you in. And its method isn't repulsion, it's fascination. It's the feeling of locking eyes with someone across a room and being seized by something you can't name. It's the person you can't stop thinking about, not because they're objectively remarkable, but because something about them reaches into a part of you that you didn't know was there. It's the ache of longing that goes so far beyond physical attraction that it almost feels spiritual. You've felt this before, and you've probably called it love. Jung would say, carefully, precisely, and with the full weight of decades of clinical evidence, that what you were feeling was not love. It was recognition. Recognition of a part of yourself that you have never been allowed to live. He called it the Anima in men, the Animus in women. And understanding what it is, how it operates, and what it's actually trying to show you will dismantle everything you thought you knew about attraction, relationships, and what it means to find the one. To understand the Anima and Animus, you first need to understand something about how Jung viewed the human psyche, something that was radical in his time and is still widely misunderstood in ours. Jung observed that every person, regardless of gender, carries within them a psychological counterpart, an inner figure that embodies the qualities opposite to their dominant conscious identity. In his original framework, he described it like this: a man whose conscious personality is shaped by the masculine qualities his culture demanded, rationality, assertiveness, emotional control, independence, carries within his unconscious a feminine figure. She holds everything his conscious identity was not allowed to include: emotional depth, receptivity, intuition, vulnerability, relational sensitivity. He called her the Anima. Conversely, a woman whose conscious personality was shaped by the feminine qualities her culture demanded, nurturing, accommodating, emotionally expressive, relationally focused, carries within her unconscious a masculine figure. He holds what her conscious identity excluded: assertiveness, intellectual authority, decisive action, boundary setting, autonomous will. He called him the Animus. Now, before we go further, an important note. Jung was writing in the early 20th century. His language around gender was shaped by that era. The underlying principle, however, transcends the binary. What Jung was really describing is this: whatever your conscious identity has been shaped to emphasize, your unconscious compensates by developing the opposite. If your life has demanded that you be strong, your unconscious holds your tenderness. If your life has demanded that you be gentle, your unconscious holds your ferocity. If you've been trained to lead with logic, your unconscious carries your intuition. If you've been trained to lead with emotion, your unconscious carries your capacity for detachment and analysis. The Anima and Animus are not about biological sex. They are about psychological compensation. The unconscious always seeks balance, and the inner figure is the psyche's attempt to represent everything the conscious personality left out. This is important, because this inner figure, this hidden counterpart, doesn't just sit quietly in the unconscious the way you might store an old photograph in a drawer. It acts, it influences, it seduces, and the primary arena in which it does all of this is your romantic life. Here is the single most important thing Jung ever said about romantic attraction, and it's the thing that, once understood, makes your entire relationship history suddenly and uncomfortably legible. You do not fall in love with a person. You fall in love with a projection. When you encounter someone who embodies the qualities carried by your Anima or Animus, someone who externally represents what you've internally repressed, something extraordinary happens in the psyche. The unconscious projects the inner figure onto the outer person, and suddenly, this flesh and blood human being is wrapped in an archetypal glow that has almost nothing to do with who they actually are. This is what being swept off your feet actually is. It's not two souls recognizing each other across time. It's your unconscious recognizing itself, its own missing half, reflected in someone else's face. And the experience is intoxicating, electric, overwhelming. It feels like fate, like destiny, like the most real thing you've ever encountered. But it's a mirage, a beautiful, compelling, psychologically necessary mirage, but a mirage nonetheless. Because what you're seeing when you look at this person is not them. It's the anima, it's the animus, it's the unlived part of your own psyche, projected outward, animated by a stranger who happens to carry the right shape. And this is exactly why, the most intense romantic connections so often become the most painful. The pattern is almost universal, and once you see it, you'll recognize it everywhere. Stage 1. Enchantment. You meet someone and everything ignites. The connection feels unprecedented. You've never felt this understood, this seen, this alive. They seem to complete you in a way no one else ever has. But they're not completing you. Your unconscious is completing itself, using them as a screen. Stage 2. Fusion. You merge. Boundaries dissolve. Their moods become your moods. Their presence becomes necessary for your sense of self. You begin to organize your life around the relationship, not because it's healthy, but because the projection has made them feel like a part of you. And in a sense, they are. They're carrying the part of you that you haven't integrated. Stage 3. Disillusionment. The real person begins to show through the projection. They do something the anima or animus would never do. They fail to be the archetype. They are moody, inconsistent, flawed, human, and you feel not just disappointed, but betrayed, as if they broke a promise they never made. Because the promise wasn't made by them, it was made by your own unconscious, and the person standing in front of you never agreed to be the vessel of your unlived life. Stage 4. Resentment or repetition. The relationship either collapses under the weight of impossible expectations, or it survives in a diminished form, with both people quietly grieving the loss of the enchantment and neither understanding what actually happened. And then, if the anima or animus remains unintegrated, the cycle begins again, with someone new, someone who, remarkably, carries the same essential qualities as the last one, and the one before that. Because you're not choosing partners, your unconscious is choosing mirrors, over and over, until you stop looking outside for what can only be found within. Jung mapped the development of the anima and animus through progressive stages, each one representing a deeper, more mature, and more integrated relationship with the inner figure. These stages don't just describe psychological development in the abstract, they describe the evolution of how you love. I'll walk through the anima stages first, then the animus. But remember, these are not gender-locked. They represent a universal trajectory from unconscious projection to conscious wholeness, and the underlying movement applies to everyone. The 4 stages of the anima. Stage 1, Eve. The inner feminine is experienced as purely biological. Attraction is physical. The other person is an object of desire, not a subject with depth. Relationships at this stage are about possession and gratification. The inner world is completely unacknowledged. Stage 2, Helen, named for Helen of Troy. The inner feminine is now experienced as a romantic ideal, beautiful, captivating, worth fighting for, but still a projection. The person at this stage falls in love with an image. They worship their partner, pedestalize them, and are devastated when the image cracks. This is where most love addictions live. Stage 3, Mary. The inner feminine evolves into something associated with virtue, spiritual depth, and moral guidance. Relationships at this stage carry a devotional quality. The partner is seen as pure, almost sacred. There's more depth here, but the projection is still active. The person is relating to an archetype, not a human being. Stage 4, Sophia. The inner feminine is finally integrated. Sophia means wisdom. At this stage, the man no longer projects the feminine onto others. He has developed, within himself, the qualities the anima represents. emotional intelligence, intuition, creative receptivity, relational depth. He doesn't need a woman to carry his soul. He carries it himself. And from that completeness, he can finally love a real person, not a projection. The 4 stages of the Animus. Stage 1, the strong man. The inner masculine is experienced as raw physical power. Attraction is based on strength, dominance, protection. The partner is valued for what they can shield you from, not for who they are. Stage 2, the doer. The inner masculine evolves into a figure of initiative, planning, and action. The partner is valued for their competence, their ambition, their ability to build. Still a projection, but a more sophisticated one. Stage 3, the professor. The inner masculine becomes an intellectual authority. The partner is valued for their ideas, their knowledge, their ability to articulate and persuade. Relationships at this stage often have a teacher-student dynamic. The woman projects wisdom onto the man and diminishes her own intellectual authority. Stage 4, the meaning. The inner masculine is fully integrated. The woman has developed within herself the qualities the animus represents: assertiveness, clarity of thought, independent judgment, the capacity for decisive action. She no longer needs a man to be her voice, her will, or her strength. She has her own. And from that place of inner authority, she can love without losing herself. The trajectory is the same in both cases, from projection to integration, from seeking in others to developing within, from romantic fantasy to genuine relationship. And the critical insight is this: you cannot reach stage 4 with another person if you haven't reached it within yourself first. No relationship can complete you, because the missing piece was never in someone else. It was in your own unconscious, waiting to be reclaimed. So what changes when you begin to integrate the anima or animus? What does it look like? Not in theory, but in your actual, lived, daily experience. The first thing you'll notice is that the charge around romantic attraction shifts. You'll still feel drawn to people. You'll still experience chemistry. But the desperate, all-consuming quality, the feeling that you'll die without this person, that they hold the key to your happiness, that you finally found your missing half, that begins to fade. Not because you've become cynical, because you've become whole. You'll start to catch yourself mid-projection. You'll meet someone magnetic, and instead of surrendering to the enchantment, a quiet inner voice will say, "What am I seeing in them that I haven't developed in myself?" And that question, asked honestly, will change the entire trajectory of the relationship. Because now you're not falling into an archetype, you're standing beside a real person, and you can choose them, or not, from clarity rather than compulsion. The second shift happens in existing relationships. If you're in a partnership, integrating the anima or animus transforms the dynamic, sometimes dramatically. Because you stop needing your partner to be what you refuse to become yourself. The man who integrates his anima stops needing his wife to be his emotional translator. He develops his own emotional vocabulary. The woman who integrates her animus stops needing her husband to make every hard decision. She trusts her own judgment. And in that mutual reclamation, both people taking back the parts they'd outsourced to each other, the relationship either deepens profoundly or reveals that it was built entirely on projection. Both outcomes are honest. Both are necessary. The third shift is internal, and it's the most important. When the anima or animus is integrated, you experience an inner partnership, a dialogue between the dominant and recessive aspects of your personality. Logic and intuition begin to cooperate rather than compete. Strength and vulnerability coexist without contradiction. Action and receptivity find a rhythm that feels, for the first time, natural. You stop being half a person searching for your other half. You become a whole person capable of genuine intimacy. Intimacy that isn't born from need, but from overflow. Jung considered this inner marriage, the union of conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, persona and soul, to be one of the most advanced achievements of individuation. And it sets the stage for the final discovery, the one at the very center of everything. Before we move on, I want to leave you with something to sit with. Think about the person who has affected you most powerfully in your romantic life. Not necessarily your current partner, the one who got under your skin the deepest, the one who lit you up the most or destroyed you the most, the one you still think about even when you wish you didn't. Now ask yourself this: what quality in them captivated me the most? Was it their confidence, their emotional openness, their independence, their wildness, their calm, their intellect, their tenderness, their fearlessness? Whatever that quality is, whatever drew you in with a force that felt almost magnetic, almost predestined, that is the quality your psyche is asking you to develop within yourself. That person was not your soulmate, they were your mirror, and the love you felt, as real as it was, as powerful as it was your own wholeness trying to come home. Let it come home. The persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, three hidden figures that have been shaping your life from beneath the surface of consciousness. But all three of them, the mask, the exile, the inner beloved, they all orbit something deeper, something at the very center of the psyche that Jung spent his entire career trying to reach. He called it the self. Not the self you think you know, not the everyday I that pays bills and makes plans and worries about what people think. Something else entirely. The archetype of wholeness, the still point at the center of the storm, the thing you've been circling your whole life, in every relationship, every crisis, every moment of restless searching, without knowing what you were looking for. Module 5, the self, and it changes everything that came before it. You've now met the three figures that live beneath the surface of your conscious mind. The persona, the mask you built to survive. The shadow, everything the mask was designed to hide. The anima, or animus, the inner counterpart you've been projecting onto lovers, searching for in others what could only ever be developed within. Three figures, three layers of the unconscious, each one powerful enough to run your life without your permission. But here's what I haven't told you yet. None of them are the center. The persona, the shadow, the anima, and animus, they are all satellites. They orbit something that sits at the very core of the psyche like a sun that the planets revolve around, generating gravity, generating light, generating the pull that you've felt your entire life without being able to name its source. Jung called it the self, and he considered it the most important discovery of his career. More important than the shadow, more important than the archetypes, more important than the collective unconscious itself. Because the self is the reason the unconscious exists. It is the organizing intelligence behind every dream you've ever had, every crisis you've ever endured, every restless impulse that told you, this isn't it yet, keep going. This module is the center of the course, because the self is the center of everything, and understanding it, truly understanding it, will reframe not just your psychology, but your entire sense of what it means to be alive. We need to begin with a distinction that sounds simple, but is actually one of the most disorienting ideas in all of psychology. The self is not the self. When you say I, when you think about who you are, when you make decisions, when you look in the mirror, the I that's doing all of that is what Jung called the ego. The ego is the center of conscious awareness. It's the manager, the narrator, the one who believes it's running the show. The self is something else entirely. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious combined. It includes everything: your ego, your persona, your shadow, your anima or animus, your personal unconscious, your connection to the collective unconscious, and dimensions of your inner life that you have never accessed and may never fully access. The ego is a flashlight. It illuminates a small circle in an enormous dark room. The self is the room. And here's the relationship between them that defines the entire process of individuation. The ego thinks it's in charge. The self actually is. The ego plans. The self arranges. The ego sets goals based on what the conscious mind thinks it wants. The self orchestrates experiences, including suffering, including failure, including crisis, based on what the whole psyche actually needs. That promotion you didn't get that devastated you at the time, and that, years later, you realized redirected you towards something more authentic? The self. That relationship that fell apart despite your desperate efforts to hold it together, and that, in the aftermath, cracked you open in exactly the way you needed to be cracked? The self. That period of your life where nothing made sense, where every plan collapsed, where you felt completely lost, and that, looking back, was the only time you were actually being honest with yourself? The self. The self doesn't operate on the ego's timeline. It doesn't share the ego's priorities, and it will dismantle the ego's carefully constructed life, without hesitation, without apology, if that life is preventing you from becoming whole. This is terrifying to the ego, absolutely terrifying, because it means you are not in control, not in the way you think you are. There is an intelligence operating within you, deeper than thought, older than memory, more patient than anything you've ever encountered, and it has an agenda. That agenda is individuation, and whether you cooperate with it or resist it, it will pursue that agenda until the day you die. The only question is how much unnecessary suffering you create by fighting it. If the self is the organizing center of the psyche, if it's the intelligence behind the scenes, shaping your life toward wholeness, then a natural question arises. How does it speak to you? Because it doesn't use words, it doesn't send emails, it doesn't sit you down and explain the plan. The self communicates through a language that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten how to read. And if you learn to read it, even partially, your experience of being alive will transform. The first language of the self is dreams. Jung was unequivocal about this. He believed that every dream, every single one, is a message from the unconscious to the conscious mind, not random neural firing, not meaningless brain activity during sleep, a communication. The self speaks in dreams because dreams bypass the ego's defenses. The persona is offline during sleep, the censorship relaxes, and the deeper psyche, the self, seizes that window to deliver information that the waking mind refuses to hear. This is why your most vivid dreams often come during your most turbulent periods. The greater the distance between who you're living as and who you actually are, the louder the self has to shout. And it shouts in symbols, in images, in narratives that don't follow waking logic but carry an emotional charge that lingers for hours, sometimes days. The recurring dream you've had since childhood, the one where you're being chased, or lost in a building, or standing in front of a crowd unable to speak, that dream is not random. It is the self, showing you the same unresolved material over and over, year after year, until you finally pay attention. The second language of the self is synchronicity. We touched on this concept earlier in the context of empaths, but here, in the framework of individuation, synchronicity takes on its full meaning. Jung defined synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence, an event in the outer world that corresponds, with no causal connection, to an inner psychological state. You're thinking about changing careers, and 3 strangers in the same week independently mention the exact field you've been considering. You're grappling with a decision about a relationship, and a book falls off a shelf open to a passage that addresses your exact dilemma. You dream about a symbol you've never seen before, and the next day it appears on a billboard, in a conversation, on the cover of a magazine. The ego dismisses these as coincidence. The self arranged them, not magically, not supernaturally, but through what Jung described as the deep interconnection between the psyche and the physical world, an interconnection that becomes visible precisely when the individual is at a critical point in their development. Synchronicities tend to cluster around moments of transformation, around thresholds, around the exact moments when the ego is being asked to let go and the self is trying to show the way. If you start paying attention to them, not with superstition, but with honest curiosity, you will begin to notice a pattern, a direction, as if something is leaving breadcrumbs through your life, and the trail leads somewhere you couldn't have consciously planned. The third language of the self is symptoms. This one is harder to hear, but it's often the loudest. When the self's messages through dreams and synchronicities go unheeded, when the ego is too defended, too rigid, too committed to the persona's agenda, the self escalates. And its escalation often takes the form of psychological or even physical symptoms, the anxiety that arrives without cause, the depression that descends despite everything in your life being fine, the illness that has no clear medical origin, the addiction that defies willpower, the creative block that nothing seems to resolve. Jung did not see these as malfunctions. He saw them as communications, the self, using the only channels still available, trying to redirect a life that has wandered too far from its authentic course. This is not to say that all illness is psychological, but Jung believed, and a growing body of psychosomatic research supports, that a significant portion of human suffering is the unconscious reacting to a conscious life that has become intolerable to the deeper self. Your symptoms may not just be problems to solve, they may be messages to decode. The fourth language of the self is what Jung called numinous experience. These are the moments that stop you in your tracks. The sudden, overwhelming experience of awe. The feeling, in nature, in music, in silence, in the presence of something sacred, that you are part of something vast, something intelligent, something that knows you better than you know yourself. These experiences are not hallucinations. They are not delusions. In Jung's framework, they are the moments when the ego's boundary temporarily thins and the self becomes directly perceptible. People who have had numinous experiences, and most people have had at least one, even if they've never named it, often describe them as the most real moments of their lives, more real than ordinary waking consciousness, as if everyday life is the dream and the numinous moment is the awakening. Jung took these experiences extremely seriously. He considered them evidence that the self is not merely a psychological construct, but a living reality, a center of intelligence within the psyche that is, in some sense, larger than the individual who contains it. And that idea, that there is something within you that is greater than you, is where individuation crosses from psychology into something that can only be called sacred. Now we reach the most critical concept in this entire module, perhaps in this entire course. The relationship between the ego and the self is not a battle. It's not a hierarchy where one must conquer the other. It's an axis, a dynamic, living relationship that determines the quality of your entire psychological life. When the axis is broken, when the ego has lost contact with the self, you experience what most of the modern world is experiencing right now: meaninglessness. The chronic, low-grade despair of a life that functions but doesn't mean anything. The ego is running the show alone, making decisions based on fear, social comparison, and inherited values. And it has no access to the deeper source of guidance, purpose, and vitality that the self provides. This is the condition of most people alive today. Not clinically ill, not overtly suffering, just disconnected, managing a life rather than living one. When the axis is overwhelmed, when the self floods the ego with more unconscious material than the ego can process, you get the opposite problem: psychic inflation, grandiosity. The person who believes they are divinely chosen, the person who identifies with an archetype, the savior, the prophet, the enlightened one, and loses the ability to function in ordinary reality. This is what Jung saw happen to people who opened the unconscious without adequate preparation. The self is vast. If the ego encounters it without sufficient structure, it doesn't integrate, it drowns. This is why individuation is a process and not an event. This is why it requires patience, discipline, and respect for the power of the unconscious. The goal is not to demolish the ego. The goal is to shift the ego from the center of the psyche to its proper position, as the servant of the self, the conscious instrument through which the self expresses itself in the world. When this axis is healthy, when the ego maintains its structure while remaining permeable to the self's guidance, something remarkable happens. You begin to experience meaning, not the meaning you manufacture through goals and achievements, a meaning that arises from within, unbidden, self-sustaining. A sense that your life is connected to something larger than your personal story. That the things happening to you, even the painful things, especially the painful things, have a purpose that the ego alone could never perceive. Jung described this as the religious function of the psyche, and he was very careful to distinguish this from religion in the institutional sense. He wasn't talking about churches or doctrines or belief systems. He was talking about a direct, lived experience of connection to something numinous within the psyche itself. He believed this experience is not optional. It is a fundamental human need. And when it is not met, when the ego-self axis is severed, the person doesn't just lose meaning. They replace meaning with substitutes: addiction, consumerism, political extremism, workaholism. The desperate attempt to fill a hole that was never meant to be filled from the outside, because it can only be filled by restoring the relationship with the self. This is not spirituality as escape. This is spirituality as psychological necessity. And for the person on the path of individuation, restoring this axis, reconnecting the ego to the self, is not just one task among many. It is the task, the entire task. Everything else, shadow work, anima integration, persona flexibility, these are all in service of one goal: bringing the conscious personality into alignment with the organizing center of the whole psyche. When that alignment occurs, even partially, even temporarily, you know it. Not because someone tells you, not because you read about it, because everything in your life suddenly makes sense, not logically, not causally, but in a way that is deeper than logic. A felt sense that you are, at last, living your actual life, that you are, at last, where you were always meant to be. That feeling is not an illusion. It is the self, recognized. Individuation is not something you can force, but you can recognize when it's happening. And recognition itself accelerates the process, because attention is the ego's way of saying to the self, "I'm listening." Here are the signs. Your dreams become more vivid, more structured, and more symbolic. You begin to notice recurring images: circles, squares, mandalas, spirals, quaternity patterns, sacred geometry. These are what Jung called symbols of the self. They appear in dreams spontaneously when the psyche is reorganizing around its center. You don't have to manufacture them. They arrive on their own, and their arrival is a sign that the individuation process is active. You develop an increasing tolerance for paradox. The world stops needing to be black or white. You can hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. This is painful, and this is necessary. I am strong, and I am vulnerable. I don't know what's happening, and I trust the process. The ego demands certainty. The self operates in paradox. Your growing comfort with not knowing is a direct sign of the self's influence expanding. Synchronicities increase and begin to feel less like coincidence and more like conversation. The meaningful coincidences don't just happen. They cluster. They respond to your inner state. They seem to confirm the direction you're moving in, or redirect you when you've wandered. You stop dismissing them. You start paying attention. And the more you pay attention, the more they appear, as if the self rewards awareness with more awareness. You begin to feel guided by something you can't name. It's not a voice, it's not a plan. It's more like a current, a subtle but persistent pull towards certain experiences, certain people, certain choices. The ego doesn't understand it, but something deeper does. And when you follow it, when you trust the pull against the ego's protests, things tend to work out in ways you couldn't have engineered. Your relationship with suffering changes. You don't seek pain, you don't romanticize it. But when it comes, you meet it differently. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this trying to show me?" That shift, from victimhood to inquiry, is one of the clearest markers of the self's presence in your conscious life. You experience moments of unexpected wholeness, fleeting, unpredictable, sometimes in nature, sometimes in silence, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary day. A sudden, piercing feeling that everything is exactly as it should be, that you are exactly where you need to be, that beneath the chaos of the surface, something is holding you. Those moments are not wishful thinking. They are the self, briefly visible to an ego that has finally, even for an instant, stopped trying to run the show. You now have the complete map of the inner world. The persona, who you pretend to be. The shadow, who you were forbidden to be. The anima and animus, who you've been searching for in others. And the self, who you actually are, in totality, beneath and beyond all of it. These are the territories. These are the figures. But knowing the map is not the same as walking the terrain. The next module is about the walk itself, the lived, felt, often agonizing experience of what happens when individuation stops being a concept you understand and becomes a process you're inside of. Jung called it the night sea journey, and it is the hardest thing a human being can go through, not because of what happens to you, because of what happens within you. Module 6, the descent, and there's no preparing for it, only going through. For 5 modules, I've been giving you a map, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self, concepts, frameworks, language for things you may have felt but never had words for. But here's the truth about maps. A map of the ocean is not the ocean. You can study every current, memorize every depth, trace every coastline with your finger, and the moment you step into the water, none of it prepares you for the cold. This module is about the cold. This is about what individuation actually feels like when it stops being something you're reading about and becomes something that is happening to you. When the structures you've relied on begin to dissolve. When the identity you thought was solid turns out to be vapor. When you find yourself in the middle of a transformation that you didn't choose, can't control, and aren't sure you'll survive. Jung called it the Nikia, a word borrowed from ancient Greek, referring to the hero's descent into the underworld. Homer used it to describe Odysseus's journey to the land of the dead. The Sumerians told it through Inanna's descent. The Egyptians told it through the soul's passage through the Duat. Christianity told it through Christ's 3 days in the tomb. Every civilization, in every era, has told this same story. Because it isn't a story, it's a pattern, an archetypal blueprint for what happens to the human psyche when it is called to die to what it was and be reborn as what it's meant to become. Jung called it the night sea journey. And if you're in it right now, if something in the last 5 modules has been hitting you not as information but as recognition, then what I'm about to say is not theory, it's a lifeline. The descent into the night sea journey doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with the force of a hurricane. Sometimes it seeps in like water under a door, so gradually that by the time you notice, you're already submerged. But it always has a trigger. And the triggers fall into patterns that Jung observed across hundreds of patients and that have been confirmed by every depth psychologist since. The first trigger is catastrophic loss, death, divorce, the end of a career that defined you, a diagnosis that rewrites your future, a betrayal so fundamental that the world you thought you lived in ceases to exist. These are the dramatic entries, the ones that leave no room for denial. One day you are one person, living one life. The next day that person is gone, and you are standing in the rubble, unable to recognize yourself. Loss of this magnitude doesn't just hurt, it dismantles. It tears away the external structures the persona was attached to, the role, the relationship, the identity, and leaves the ego exposed to the unconscious without its usual defenses. This is why grief, in its deepest form, is not just an emotion, it is a portal. The pain cracks you open, and what rushes in through the crack is everything you've been keeping out. The second trigger is disillusionment. This is slower, subtler, and in some ways more destabilizing than loss, because there's no external event to point to, no villain, no catastrophe. Just the dawning, unbearable realization that the life you built was built on a lie. Not someone else's lie, yours. The career you pursued because your father valued status. The relationship you stayed in because leaving would mean admitting failure. The personality you constructed because it was the one that got love. The goals you chased because everyone told you they mattered, and you never stopped long enough to ask if they mattered to you. Disillusionment doesn't arrive as a single revelation. It arrives as an accumulation. 1,000 small moments of inauthenticity that you ignored, justified, rationalized, until one day the weight of them becomes unbearable, and the structure collapses, not from the outside in, from the inside out. The third trigger is what Jung specifically identified as the midlife transition. Not the midlife crisis as popular culture mocks it, the red sports car, the affair, the sudden recklessness. Those are symptoms. They are the ego's panicked attempt to avoid the descent by replacing the old persona with a shinier one. The real midlife transition is quieter and far more dangerous to the old identity. It begins when the strategies that worked in the first half of life stop working in the second. The ambition that drove you in your 20s feels hollow in your 40s. The relationships built on mutual projection can no longer sustain the weight of two people who are quietly, separately, becoming someone new. The values inherited from family and culture, success, security, respectability, begin to ring false. Not because they were always false, because you've outgrown them. And what you're growing into doesn't have a name yet. Jung saw the midlife transition not as a crisis, but as an invitation. The psyche's way of saying, the first half of your life was about building the ego, the second half is about transcending it, and the bridge between the two is the descent. The fourth trigger, and this is the one no one talks about, is nothing at all. No loss, no disillusionment, no midlife reckoning. Just a slow, creeping, inexplicable withdrawal of meaning from a life that, by every external measure, should feel fulfilling. You wake up one morning and the color is gone. Not dramatically, not suddenly, it's just dimmer. The things that used to excite you don't. The people who used to energize you don't. You go through the motions, work, eat, socialize, sleep, and none of it feels real, as if you're watching your own life through glass. This is perhaps the most disorienting trigger of all, because there's nothing to blame, nothing to fix, nothing to point to and say, this is why I feel this way. And so most people who experience it assume something is clinically wrong with them. They go to a doctor, they get a prescription, they try to medicate the descent away. But the descent is not a disease. The emptiness is not a malfunction. It is the self, withdrawing its energy from a life that no longer serves the process of individuation. It is the psyche, going on strike, refusing to invest vitality in a structure that has become a cage. And the only way forward is down. Once the descent begins, regardless of what triggered it, it moves through stages. Not neatly, not linearly. These stages overlap, circle back, and sometimes hit simultaneously. But they form a recognizable pattern, one that Jung mapped in his patients, in his study of mythology, and in his own devastating personal experience. Stage 1. Dissolution. The old identity begins to come apart, not all at once, in pieces. You lose interest in things that used to define you. Hobbies that once brought joy now feel pointless. Social gatherings that once energized you now drain you. Goals you were pursuing with conviction now seem absurd, as if you suddenly woke up and realized you've been climbing a mountain you never wanted to summit. You start canceling plans, not because you're depressed, although it looks like depression from the outside, but because something in you is refusing to participate in the old life. Something is pulling you inward, away from the surface, away from performance, away from everything that isn't essential. The people around you will notice. They'll ask what's wrong. They'll suggest you're burned out. They'll recommend vacations, therapy, medication. And some of that may help with symptoms, but none of it addresses what's actually happening. What's actually happening is that the persona is losing its grip. The identity that held your life together, that told you who you were, what you valued, where you belonged, is dissolving. And what's left in its absence is not a new identity, it's a void. And you have to stay in the void. That's the work. Not filling it, not escaping it, staying in it. Stage 2. The encounter with the shadow. As the persona dissolves, what it was holding back begins to surface. This is where the shadow work from Module 3 stops being an intellectual exercise and becomes a lived emergency. Emotions you've suppressed for decades break through. Rage that doesn't seem to have a source. Grief that doesn't seem to have an object. Shame so old and so deep that it feels less like a feeling and more like a physical location. A place inside your body where something terrible is stored. Old memories resurface. Not always as clear narratives, sometimes as fragments, images, body sensations, dreams that wake you at 3 in the morning with your heart hammering and a feeling of dread that takes hours to dissipate. Relationships begin to strain, not because of conflict, but because you are no longer able to perform. The mask is slipping, and the people who only knew the mask are frightened by what they see behind it. Some will pull away. Some will try to push you back into the old role. Some will take your transformation personally, as if your healing is an accusation against them. This is one of the loneliest stages of the human experience. You are surrounded by people who cannot see what you're going through, and you cannot explain it to them, because the language doesn't exist in the vocabulary of a culture that has no framework for this kind of descent. Stage 3. The confrontation. Every night sea journey has a moment at the center, a single point of maximum darkness. The mythological traditions all describe it: the belly of the whale, the bottom of the underworld, the cave where the dragon lives, the tomb before the resurrection. In psychological terms, this is the moment where you face the thing you have been running from your entire life. And here's what no one can tell you in advance: the thing is different for everyone. For some, it's grief. The accumulated, unfelt grief of a lifetime. Every loss that was never mourned. Every goodbye that was never completed. Every version of yourself that died without a funeral. And in this stage, you finally weep for all of it. Not delicately, not therapeutically. You weep as if something inside you has broken open, and decades of unshed tears are pouring out through the crack. For some, it's rage. The fury that was never permitted. The anger at what was done to you, at what was taken from you, at the years you lost to a life that wasn't yours. And in this stage, you feel that rage in its full, terrifying power. Not directed at anyone, not expressed destructively, but felt, completely, for the first time. For some, it's the terror of meaninglessness, the confrontation with the possibility that everything you believed, about yourself, about life, about why any of this matters, might be wrong. That the ground you built your life on was never solid. And in this stage, you stand in that void without anything to hold on to and ask, if none of what I thought was true is actually true, then what is? For some, and this is the confrontation Jung himself described most vividly, it's the encounter with the self itself, the direct, unmediated experience of the totality of the psyche. An encounter so vast, so overwhelming, so incommensurable with ordinary consciousness that the ego genuinely doesn't know if it will survive the experience. Whatever form the confrontation takes, and you will not know until you are in it, it demands the same thing: surrender. Stage 4. The surrender. This is the turning point, and it is the most misunderstood part of the entire process. Surrender does not mean giving up. It does not mean resignation. It does not mean passivity or defeat. Surrender means the ego stops fighting. It stops trying to control the descent. It stops trying to figure it out, manage it, schedule it, optimize it. It stops trying to maintain the illusion that it is in charge. And it says, not with words, but with its entire being, I don't know. I can't do this alone. Something larger than me is at work here, and I am going to stop resisting it. That moment, the moment the ego kneels, is the axis point of individuation. Because it is the first time in your life that the ego and the self are in right relationship. The ego has finally stepped out of the center, and the self, patient, vast, waiting, finally has room to move. You can't plan this moment. You can't manufacture it through technique or willpower. It happens when the ego has exhausted every other option, when every strategy has failed, when you have hit the very bottom of your capacity to hold it all together. And in that total depletion, in that absolute surrender of control, something shifts. Not dramatically, not with fireworks, often very quietly. A breath that feels different, a lightness that appears without explanation. A sense, fragile, tentative, barely there, that the worst is over, that something new is forming in the wreckage, that you are still here, and that here is somewhere you've never been before. Stage 5. The return. The return is not a reversal. You don't go back to who you were. That person is gone, completed. Their chapter is finished. The return is an emergence, a slow, uncertain, often stumbling re-entry into the world, but as someone different, someone you don't fully recognize yet, someone who is quieter than the person who entered the descent, less certain, less defended, and, in a way that's hard to articulate but impossible to miss, more real. The colors come back, gradually. Not the same colors, not the same palette of meaning you had before. Something more muted in some places, more vivid in others, as if the descent recalibrated your entire perceptual system. You notice things you didn't notice before, beauty you overlooked, pain you couldn't feel, connections you were too defended to receive. You speak less, not because you have less to say, but because you've learned that silence holds more than words. And the people who see you now, really see you, will say something that you've heard before, but that means something entirely different now. They'll say, "You've changed." And for the first time in your life, that will be true. I've been describing this process in abstract terms, but I want you to know, Jung didn't just theorize about the night sea journey. He survived one. In 1913, at the age of 38, Jung initiated what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of voluntary descent that lasted nearly 4 years and brought him closer to psychosis than any other experience of his life. It began with the end of his relationship with Sigmund Freud, which was not just a professional break, but the collapse of a father-figure dynamic that had structured Jung's entire intellectual identity. When that structure fell, it took everything with it: his sense of professional belonging, his theoretical certainty, his persona as Freud's protege and heir. And in the aftermath, instead of rebuilding the persona, instead of finding a new mentor, a new identity, a new structure to attach himself to, Jung did something that most psychologists would call reckless. He went inward. He began a practice he would later call active imagination, deliberately engaging with the contents of the unconscious while awake. He would sit in his study, quiet his rational mind, and allow images, voices, and figures to rise from the depths. What came up nearly overwhelmed him. He encountered archetypal figures, a wise old man he called Philemon, a dark feminine figure he called Salome, a serpent, a dwarf, a cast of inner characters who spoke with autonomy and intelligence that shocked him. He had visions of apocalyptic floods, of rivers of blood, of the destruction of Europe, visions that, he later noted, preceded the outbreak of World War I by mere months. He heard voices. He experienced states of consciousness that bordered on psychotic. There were periods where he wasn't sure he would come back, where the boundary between the inner world and outer reality became so thin that he had to ground himself by reciting facts about his daily life, his name, his address, his profession, just to maintain his grip on who he was. He recorded everything, obsessively, in journals, in paintings, in elaborate calligraphic manuscripts that would eventually become the Red Book, a document so private that it wasn't published until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. And from this descent, from this 4-year night sea journey that nearly destroyed him, Jung emerged with the core of everything he would teach for the rest of his life: the shadow, the anima, the self, individuation, active imagination. The entire framework that we've been exploring in this course was born not from theory, but from one man's willingness to descend into the darkest reaches of his own psyche and bring back what he found. He later wrote that this period was the most important of his life, that everything he accomplished afterward was merely the elaboration of what erupted from the unconscious during those years. He also wrote, with characteristic honesty, that he would not wish the experience on anyone. And yet, he believed it was necessary, not just for him, for anyone who takes the process of becoming whole seriously. The night sea journey is not optional. It is the price of admission to your own depth. I want to be direct with you for a moment. Most people who enter the night sea journey do not complete it. They reach the dissolution phase and interpret it as depression. They seek medication, which can be necessary and life-saving, and I'm not dismissing that, but which, in the context of individuation, can also function as a way to halt the descent before it reaches the material it was trying to reach. They reach the shadow eruption phase and interpret it as a breakdown. They panic. They cling to whatever remains of the old persona. They call the people who will tell them everything is fine, who will help them reconstruct the mask, who will convince them that the disturbing emotions are a problem to be solved rather than a message to be heard. They reach the confrontation and the terror is too much. The void is too empty. The grief is too deep. The rage is too hot. And they turn around. They retreat to the surface. They reassemble a version of the old life, maybe slightly modified, maybe with a few cosmetic changes, but fundamentally untransformed. And the descent? It waits. It doesn't punish them for turning back, but it doesn't go away either. It recedes. It bides its time. And 5 years later, or 10 or 20, it returns. With more force, with higher stakes, with less room to maneuver, because the self is patient, but it is relentless. Jung observed this pattern with clinical precision. The person who aborts the individuation process at 40 faces a more severe version of the same crisis at 50. The person who medicates the descent at 50 confronts it as a full collapse at 60. The unlived life accumulates interest, the unconscious material grows, and each time the call returns, it demands more, because more has been deferred. This is not a threat, it's an observation, and it's offered not to frighten you but to inform your choice, because you do have a choice. You can turn back, build a new persona, find a new distraction, and live with the knowledge, buried but present, that you came to the edge of your own depth and chose not to jump. Or you can stay. You can sit in the void, feel the feelings, let the mask dissolve, let the old self die. Surrender the ego's insistence that it knows best, and trust, with a trust that has no evidence and no guarantee, that something is waiting for you on the other side. If you stay, and I mean this without romanticism, without spiritual bypassing, without false comfort, what waits for you on the other side is the most real version of yourself you have ever known. Not the happiest, not the most successful, not the most comfortable, the most real. And realness, it turns out, is the only thing the soul was ever hungry for. The descent breaks you open. That is its purpose, not to destroy you, to make room. Room for what? For everything you reclaim on the other side. The shadow material, no longer exiled but integrated. The anima or animus, no longer projected but embodied. The self, no longer distant but present, active, guiding, alive in your daily experience. The next module is about that other side, what it looks like, how it feels, and what becomes possible when a human being stops being a fragment and starts being whole. Module 7, Integration, the harvest of everything you've survived. You survived the descent, or maybe you're still in it. Maybe you're watching this from inside the void, looking for some evidence that the darkness has an end, that there's something on the other side of the dissolution, the grief, the terrifying loss of everything you thought you were. There is, but I need to be honest with you about what it is, because the other side of the night sea journey is not what most people imagine. It's not a triumphant return to normal life with a few extra insights. It's not a spiritual high that makes everything easy. It's not the end of suffering. It's something much quieter than that, much stranger, and, once you adjust to it, much more valuable than anything the old life could have offered. It's wholeness, not perfection, not completion, not the absence of pain. Wholeness, the experience of being for the first time all of yourself. Not the curated version, not the performing version, not the fragment that the world found acceptable. All of it, held together, functioning as one. This module is about what that actually means, and what it looks like when a human being stops being at war with themselves and starts living from the center. We need to start here, because there are more misconceptions about the outcome of individuation than about any other part of the process. And if you carry the wrong expectation into this phase, you'll either miss the transformation entirely or reject it because it doesn't match the fantasy. Integration is not enlightenment, not in the way popular culture imagines it. You will not float above your problems. You will not reach a state of permanent bliss. You will not become immune to pain, confusion, or doubt. If someone tells you they've reached a state beyond suffering, they haven't integrated the shadow. They've built a spiritual persona. And that persona will crack just like every other one. Integration is not the elimination of the shadow. The shadow doesn't disappear. It doesn't get healed in the sense of being removed. It gets included. The anger is still there, but now you have a conscious relationship with it. The grief is still there, but now it flows instead of flooding. The parts of you that were exiled didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be welcomed. And welcome is not the same as erasure. Integration is not a permanent state. This is perhaps the most important misconception to dismantle. Individuation is not a destination you arrive at and then remain in forever. It's a dynamic process, a way of being in relationship with yourself that requires ongoing attention, ongoing honesty, ongoing willingness to meet whatever the unconscious surfaces next. You don't graduate from the psyche. You learn to live in dialogue with it. There will be days after the descent when you feel whole, grounded, and profoundly connected to yourself. And there will be days when the old patterns resurface, the shadow reasserts itself, and the persona tries to take the wheel again. The difference, the only difference, and it is everything, is that now you see it happening. You're no longer unconscious. You catch the pattern. You recognize the projection. You feel the mask sliding on, and you make a choice about whether to wear it. That awareness, that continuous, imperfect, compassionate awareness, is integration. Not a state, a practice. Not a trophy, a way of walking through the world. Integration is not becoming someone new. This is subtle but critical. You don't emerge from the night sea journey as a different person. You emerge as the person you always were, but couldn't be. The qualities that surface after integration aren't imported from somewhere else. They were always in you, in the shadow, in the anima or animus, in the depths of the self. They were always yours. What's new is not the material. What's new is your relationship to it. You've gone from exile to inclusion, from fragmentation to coherence, from a life run by the unconscious to a life informed by it. That's not becoming someone new. That's becoming, finally, yourself. So if integration isn't enlightenment, isn't perfection, and isn't a finish line, what is it? What does a person look like in their actual daily life when they've done this work? Here's what changes, practically, observably, in ways that the people around you will notice even if they can't name what they're noticing. Your emotional reactions become proportional. Before integration, your reactions were run by the shadow. A small slight triggered abandonment terror from childhood. A minor disagreement activated survival-level rage. A friend's success detonated a shame bomb that had been ticking since you were 12. After integration, you still feel, deeply, perhaps more deeply than before, because the persona's censorship is no longer muting your inner world. But the feelings match the moment. The intensity is proportional to the actual situation, rather than being hijacked by decades-old unconscious material. This doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually, reaction by reaction, trigger by trigger. Each time you catch yourself being pulled into an old pattern and choose to respond from the present instead of reacting from the past, the new neural pathway strengthens. The old one weakens. Not through suppression, through awareness. You stop needing to be right. This one surprises people, but it's one of the clearest markers of integration. The need to be right is an ego defense. It's the persona protecting its position. It's the shadow projecting its insecurity onto every disagreement. When these structures relax, when the ego no longer needs to defend an identity it knows is constructed, when the shadow's insecurities have been acknowledged rather than armored against, the desperate grip on being right simply loosens. You become capable of saying, "I don't know," without it feeling like a collapse. You can hold someone else's perspective without needing to defeat it. You can change your mind without experiencing it as a death. This isn't weakness. It's the security of someone who is no longer building their identity on the shifting sand of being correct. You attract fundamentally different dynamics. This is the one that feels almost supernatural, but is entirely psychological. When you stop projecting the shadow, you stop attracting people who mirror it. When you stop projecting the anima or animus, you stop falling into relationships built on archetypal enchantment rather than genuine connection. The people who enter your life after integration tend to be different, not because the universe is rewarding you, Because you are different. You're no longer broadcasting unconscious signals that attract complementary dysfunction. You're no longer drawn to people who carry the unlived parts of you, because you're living those parts yourself. This can be disorienting. Some of the connections you form after integration will feel less intense than the old ones, less electric, less consuming, and there will be a moment where you wonder if you've lost the capacity for passionate connection. You haven't. You've lost the capacity for projection-driven connection. And what replaces it, connection based on two whole people meeting each other in reality rather than in fantasy, is quieter, steadier, and immeasurably more nourishing. Creativity flows differently. Before integration, creative energy was locked in the shadow, trapped alongside the impulses, the wildness, the originality that the persona couldn't accommodate. The creative act felt like pulling teeth, or it came in unpredictable bursts followed by long droughts, the unconscious occasionally breaking through the persona's dam before being sealed off again. After integration, the dam is gone. Not because you destroyed it, because you made it permeable. Creative energy doesn't need to break through anymore. It flows, steadily, not always dramatically, but consistently. And the quality changes. Before, creativity was often driven by pain, by unresolved material, by the shadow's desperate attempt to be seen. After, it's driven by something closer to play, to exploration, to the self expressing itself through you without the persona's editorial interference. You develop what Jung called the religious attitude. Not religion, not dogma, not belief in any specific deity or system. A felt sense of being connected to something larger than the ego. A lived experience of meaning that doesn't depend on achievement, approval, or external validation. A quiet, persistent awareness that your life is part of a pattern, and that the pattern, however incomprehensible to the conscious mind, is intelligent. This attitude doesn't arrive through faith, it arrives through experience. You've been to the depths, you've met the shadow, you've felt the self's presence, you've surrendered the ego's illusion of control, and discovered that something caught you when you fell. That experience, not a concept, not a teaching, but a direct encounter, becomes the ground you stand on for the rest of your life. Not certainty, something better than certainty, trust. There's one more concept I need to give you, because without it, integration sounds like something you do with willpower. It's not. There's a specific mechanism in the psyche that makes integration possible. Jung called it the transcendent function, and it is, in my view, one of the most underappreciated ideas in all of psychology. Here's the problem the transcendent function solves. The conscious mind and the unconscious mind speak different languages. The ego thinks in logic, words, plans. The unconscious thinks in images, symbols, emotions, body sensations. When the two are in conflict, and during individuation they often are, the ego's instinct is to overpower the unconscious, to rationalize away the dream, to suppress the emotion, to explain the synchronicity as coincidence. That approach doesn't work. All it does is widen the gap. The transcendent function is the psyche's innate capacity to bridge this gap, to produce a third thing that is neither the ego's position nor the unconscious's position, but a synthesis that transcends both. Here's what that looks like in practice. You're facing a decision. The ego says one thing, the logical, safe, socially acceptable choice. The unconscious says another, the pull you feel in your body, the dream that keeps pointing in a different direction, the emotion that won't leave you alone no matter how many times you try to rationalize it away. Instead of forcing one to win, you hold both. You sit with the tension. You don't resolve it prematurely. You let the ego state its case. You let the unconscious state its case. And you wait. This is agonizing for the ego. The ego wants resolution. It wants certainty. It wants to decide and move on. But if you can tolerate the tension, if you can hold two contradictory truths without collapsing into one of them, something happens. A third position emerges. It doesn't come from thinking, it comes through you. Sometimes as a sudden insight, sometimes as an image, sometimes as a shift in feeling that reorients your entire perspective without any conscious effort. Sometimes you wake up one morning and you simply know, not because you figured it out, but because the transcendent function did its work while you slept. Jung considered this function to be the psyche's most sophisticated achievement, the mechanism by which opposites are held, honored, and ultimately united into something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And here's why this matters for integration specifically. The integrated person isn't someone who has eliminated their contradictions. They're someone who has learned to hold them, strength and vulnerability, logic and intuition, self and other, light and shadow, masculine and feminine. The transcendent function is what allows you to be all of these things simultaneously, without fragmenting, without choosing sides, without amputating one half of yourself to preserve the other. It is, in the most literal sense, the engine of wholeness. And you don't have to build it. It's already in you. It's been in you your whole life, waiting for you to stop forcing resolution and start trusting the tension. There's one more thing about integration that I want to name, because it's the part that catches people off guard, the part that seems contradictory until you've lived it. The more individuated you become, the more connected you feel to other people, not less, more. This seems paradoxical. Individuation sounds like a process of becoming separate, of differentiating yourself from the collective, of standing apart. And in one sense, it is. You do become more distinct, more uniquely yourself, less willing to conform for the sake of belonging, less willing to wear a mask for the sake of approval. But something unexpected happens in that differentiation. When you stop projecting the shadow, you stop seeing other people as threats, rivals, villains, or saviors. You see them as they are, flawed, complex, struggling with the same archetypal forces you've been struggling with. And instead of judgment, you feel something that the persona could never have generated: compassion, real compassion, not the performed empathy of the social mask, not the helper's high of the unintegrated caretaker, but a grounded, unsentimental, deeply felt recognition that the person in front of you is fighting a version of the same battle you've been fighting. And that recognition, that shared humanity, perceived not from the persona but from the self, creates a connection that is fundamentally different from anything you experienced before integration. Before, connection was based on need, on projection, on complementary dysfunction, on "you carry what I can't" and "I'll carry what you can't," an unconscious barter system that both people mistook for love. After integration, connection is based on overflow. You're not seeking someone to complete you, you're already complete. You're not looking for someone to carry your shadow, you carry it yourself. And from that completeness, you can meet another person without agenda, without projection, without the desperate, clinging need that masquerades as intimacy. That's when real love becomes possible, not before. Jung was fond of pointing out that you cannot truly love another person until you have loved yourself. And by love yourself, he didn't mean self-esteem or self-affirmation. He meant the radical act of embracing everything you are, shadow and all, anima and all, the beautiful and the terrible, the golden and the grotesque. When you've done that, when you've held your own totality in your arms and said, "Yes, all of this is me, and I will not exile any of it again," then, and only then, are you capable of holding another person with that same completeness. That's the paradox. Becoming whole doesn't make you more separate. It makes you more available, more present, more capable of real, undefended, honest-to-God human connection than you ever were when you were half a person desperately searching for your other half. Individuation doesn't end in solitude. It ends in a quality of togetherness that most people never access, because they never did the work of becoming someone worth bringing to the table. Integration is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different kind of story, one that doesn't have a predetermined script, one that isn't driven by the persona's ambitions, or the shadow's compulsions, or the anima's enchantments. A story written by the self, through you, in real time. The final module is about how to live that story, the daily practices, the ongoing relationship with the unconscious, the way you work, love, create, and move through the world as a whole human being. And the question that underlies all of it, the question that Jung believed was the most important question any person can ask. Now that you know who you are, What will you do with this life? Module 8. The rest of your life starts here. You have the map now, all of it. The persona, the mask that protected you until it imprisoned you. The shadow, the exile that weakened you until you brought it home. The anima and animus, the inner beloved you projected onto others until you learned to embody it yourself. The self, the center you were circling your whole life without knowing its name. The night sea journey, the descent that broke you open. And integration, the wholeness that grew in the space the breaking made. 7 modules, an entire architecture of the human psyche. More than most people will ever learn about the territory inside their own mind. But here's the question that's been underneath everything since the first minute of this course. The one that all of this has been building toward. Now what? What do you do with this? Not as a theory, not as a framework you can reference in conversations. What do you do? Tomorrow morning, next week, next year, for the rest of your life, with the knowledge that you are more than your mask, more than your wounds, more than your projections, and that there is a center within you that has been trying to guide you home since before you could speak. This final module is the answer to that question. Not a prescription, not a rigid system. A set of practices, principles, and orientations that will keep the dialogue between your conscious mind and your unconscious alive, so that individuation doesn't become something you watched a video about once, but something you live, every day, for the rest of your life. The first thing you need to understand about living individuated is that the process doesn't end. And that's not a failure, it's the design. Individuation is not linear, it's spiral. You will meet the shadow again, not because you did the work wrong the first time, but because you have more than one layer. The shadow material you integrated at 35 is not the same material that surfaces at 45. The anima or animus projection you recognized in one relationship will appear in a different form in the next. The persona you dismantled in one area of your life may still be fully operational in another. Each time you cycle back through, each time you encounter a new layer of shadow, a new projection, a new moment where the ego tries to reclaim its throne, the process is the same. But you are different. You have tools now. You have language. You have the experience of having survived the descent once before. And so each cycle is faster. Each confrontation is less terrifying. Not because the material is lighter, sometimes it's heavier, but because you know the territory. You know that the dissolution is temporary. You know that the void is not empty but pregnant. You know that the surrender is not the end, but the axis point. The spiral goes deeper with each revolution, and deeper, in this context, doesn't mean darker. It means closer. Closer to center, closer to the self, closer to the life that was always waiting for you beneath the one you were performing. Think of it like seasons. Spring doesn't come once and then it's summer forever. Spring comes, then summer, then autumn, then winter, and then spring again. But each year the garden is different, richer, more complex, more alive. That's the rhythm of the individuated life. Not a straight line to a fixed destination, a deepening spiral toward a center that keeps revealing more of itself the closer you get. And the practices I'm about to give you are how you stay on the spiral, how you keep the relationship with the unconscious active, reciprocal, and alive. These are not rituals, they're not performative. They don't require special equipment, special settings, or special beliefs. What they require is honesty, consistency, and the willingness to keep paying attention to your inner life, even when the outer life gets loud. Practice 1. Dream journaling. This is the foundation, the single most important practice for maintaining the ego-self dialogue. Because every night, every single night, the unconscious speaks to you, and every morning, most people ignore it. Here's how to do this effectively. Keep a journal and pen beside your bed. Not your phone. The light and the pull of notifications will yank you out of the hypnopompic state, the liminal zone between sleep and waking where dream memory is most accessible. The moment you wake up, before you check the time, before you think about the day, before you move your body more than necessary, write. Don't try to remember the whole dream first. Start with whatever fragment is present. A feeling, an image, a word, a color. Write that, and more will follow. Dreams are like threads. Pull one, and the rest comes with it. Don't interpret while you write. Don't judge. Don't censor. If the dream was disturbing, write it. If it was sexual, write it. If it was absurd, write it. The unconscious doesn't speak in the language of polite conversation. It speaks in the language of truth. And if you start editing that truth at the journal stage, you'll train the unconscious to stop sending it. Over time, weeks, months, patterns will emerge. Recurring symbols, recurring settings, recurring figures. These are the vocabulary of your specific unconscious. No dream dictionary can decode them for you. They are yours. And learning to read them is like learning to read a language that has been speaking to you your entire life while you had your fingers in your ears. One more thing. Pay special attention to dreams that carry a strong emotional charge, dreams that wake you up, dreams that linger all day, dreams that make you uneasy for reasons you can't articulate. These are not noise. These are priority messages. The self is underlining them for a reason. Practice 2. Active imagination. This is Jung's signature technique, and it's the one he considered most powerful for direct engagement with the unconscious while awake. Active imagination is not meditation. It's not visualization. It's not guided imagery where you follow someone else's script. It is an open, unscripted, bilateral dialogue between the ego and the unconscious. Here's the practice. Find a quiet space, sit comfortably, close your eyes, and instead of emptying your mind, let it fill. Not with thoughts, with images. Let the unconscious produce whatever it wants to produce. A landscape, a figure, a scene. Don't control it, don't direct it, just watch. When something appears, a figure, a shape, a presence, engage with it. Not by analyzing it, by relating to it. Ask it a question. Listen for a response. And here's the part that feels strange at first. The response will not come from your conscious mind. It will surprise you. It will say things you didn't plan. It will behave with an autonomy that feels genuinely other, because it is other. It's the unconscious, speaking through image and figure, making itself available for direct conversation. Jung did this for years. His dialogues with Philemon, with Salome, with the figures of his inner world, these weren't fantasies. They were active imagination sessions that he took as seriously as any conversation with a living person. You don't need to do this daily. Even once a week, 20 minutes of sitting with the unconscious and letting it speak will fundamentally change your relationship with your inner world. You'll begin to experience the unconscious not as a threatening basement, but as a living partner, one that has its own wisdom, its own perspective, its own agenda, which, as we've discussed, is your individuation. Practice 3. Shadow journaling. This is simpler than it sounds, and it's the practice that keeps the shadow integration process active long after the initial confrontation. At the end of each day, or at least several times per week, ask yourself 3 questions. Write the answers. What triggered me today? Not what annoyed me. What triggered me? What provoked a reaction that was disproportionate to the situation? What made me judgmental, defensive, ashamed, furious, or shut down in a way that didn't match the actual event? What was I projecting? Based on what you know now about projection, what quality in the other person was I reacting to that might actually live in my own shadow? What was I refusing to see in myself? What did I perform today? Where did the persona take over? Where did I say something I didn't mean, suppress something I actually felt, or present a version of myself that was designed for approval rather than truth? These questions are not comfortable. They're not supposed to be. They are a daily practice of self-honesty, a discipline that keeps the persona flexible and the shadow visible. Over months, the answers will reveal patterns you didn't know existed, and each pattern, once seen, loses its power to operate unconsciously. You don't need to fix what you find. You just need to see it. Awareness, sustained, honest, non-judgmental awareness, is the primary tool of integration. Everything else is commentary. Practice 4. Solitude. Not loneliness, not isolation, not scrolling your phone alone on the couch. Actual solitude. Unmediated time with yourself where there is no input, no stimulation, no distraction, no performance. The modern world is designed to prevent this. Every moment of silence is filled with podcasts, music, social media, news, notifications. And each of those inputs, however benign they seem, serves the same function. They keep the ego occupied so it doesn't have to face the unconscious. Solitude is the practice of removing those buffers, deliberately, regularly. It doesn't need to be hours. 15 minutes a day of genuine silence, sitting with nothing, walking with nothing, being with nothing, creates a space for the unconscious to surface. And the unconscious will use that space, not always immediately, not always dramatically, but consistently. Some of your most important insights will arrive during these periods of emptiness, not because you went looking for them, because you finally stopped running long enough for them to catch up. Practice 5. Symbol tracking. This is the practice that keeps your relationship with the self active at the conscious level. Pay attention to the images, motifs, and symbols that recur in your life, in your dreams, in your creative work, in the art you're drawn to, in the moments of numinous experience that stop you mid-step. Circles, spirals, water, fire, specific animals, specific numbers, specific landscapes that appear in dream after dream. These are not random. They are the self's vocabulary. And unlike the shadow, which communicates through triggers and projections, the self communicates through beauty, through resonance, through the quiet shock of encountering something in the outer world that perfectly mirrors something in the inner world. When you notice a recurring symbol, don't rush to interpret it. Sit with it, draw it, meditate on it. Let it unfold its meaning in its own time. The self is not in a hurry, and the symbols it sends are not puzzles to be solved. They are relationships to be deepened. Over time, you'll develop a personal symbolic language, a direct communication channel between your conscious mind and the deepest layer of your psyche. And that channel, once open, becomes the most reliable source of guidance you will ever have. More reliable than logic, more reliable than advice, more reliable than any external authority. Because it comes from the one authority that has known you, completely, without judgment, without condition, since before you were born. I want to speak directly to how individuation changes the way you relate to other people, because this is where the work meets the world. This is where the inner transformation becomes visible. You learn to love without projecting. This doesn't mean you stop being attracted to people. It doesn't mean relationships become sterile or analytical. It means you develop the capacity to see another person as they actually are, not as a vessel for your anima, not as a mirror for your shadow, not as a supporting character in the story your ego has written about your life. And seeing someone clearly, without the distortions of projection, is the prerequisite for genuine love. Not the love of enchantment and fusion, the love of recognition, the love that says, I see you. Not the version I need you to be, you, and I choose you anyway. That kind of love is only possible from wholeness, from a place where you are not asking the other person to complete you because you've already done that work yourself. You learn to set boundaries without guilt. Before individuation, boundaries felt like betrayal. Saying no felt like abandonment, not of the other person, but of the role the persona had assigned you, the caretaker, the fixer, the one who always says yes. After individuation, boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of self-preservation that make genuine connection possible. Because a relationship without boundaries is not intimacy, it's enmeshment. And enmeshment is just two personas fused together, each one terrified of what would happen if they separated. The integrated person sets boundaries not from anger, but from clarity. Not as walls, but as definitions. Clear, calm statements of where you end and the other person begins. And in that definition, paradoxically, real closeness becomes possible, because both people know they're choosing to be there, not trapped, not obligated, choosing. You learn to recognize when someone else is in their own descent. This is the gift that individuation gives you in your relationships with others. Because once you've been through the night sea journey yourself, you recognize the signs, the withdrawal, the loss of interest, the sudden emotional volatility, the look in someone's eyes that says, I don't know who I am anymore. And instead of panicking, Instead of trying to fix them, save them, pull them back to who they were, you can do the most loving thing a human being can do for another person in crisis. You can hold space. Not by offering solutions, not by minimizing their pain, not by projecting your own journey onto theirs, but by being present, by trusting the process, not because it's comfortable, but because you know from experience that the descent has a purpose, and that the person in it needs a witness, not a rescuer. That capacity, to be with someone in their darkness without trying to fix it, flee it, or absorb it, is one of the rarest and most valuable qualities a human being can develop. And it only comes from having been in the darkness yourself. There's a question that haunts almost every person who goes through individuation. It usually arrives somewhere after the descent, during the early stages of integration, and it sounds like this: what am I supposed to do with my life now? The old answers don't work. The career that was driven by the persona's need for validation feels hollow. The goals that were inherited from family or culture feel foreign. The metrics of success that once organized your ambition, money, status, recognition, feel like they belong to someone else's life. And for a while, that's disorienting. The old compass is broken, and the new one hasn't fully calibrated yet. But it does calibrate. And when it does, the orientation it points toward is fundamentally different from anything the ego could have designed. The individuated person doesn't ask, "What career will make me successful?" They ask, "What is trying to express itself through me?" That sounds abstract, but it's actually the most practical question you can ask, because the answer is already in you. It's in the patterns of your fascination, in the creative impulses you've been suppressing, in the subjects that light you up at midnight when no one is watching and no one is grading you, in the activities where time disappears, not because you're escaping, but because you're fully present. The self has been pointing you toward your work your entire life. You just couldn't hear it over the noise of the persona's agenda. After individuation, the noise quiets, and what remains? The signal that was always underneath becomes audible. Sometimes it's a dramatic redirection, a complete career change, a leap into something the old you would have called crazy. Sometimes it's subtler, a shift in how you do the same work rather than what work you do. Less performance, more presence, less driven by external metrics, more guided by internal meaning. Either way, the quality of the work changes, because the work is no longer being done by the persona, it's being done through the self. And work that comes from the self carries a quality that is difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable to those who encounter it. It has depth, it has authenticity, it has the unmistakable resonance of something that was made by a person who is actually in what they're making. Not performing, not optimizing, present. And here's something Jung observed that might surprise you. The individuated person often feels called to serve, not from guilt, not from obligation, not from the old caretaker persona trying to earn love through usefulness, from overflow. When you are whole, when you are no longer spending 80% of your energy managing the shadow, maintaining the persona, and projecting the anima, you suddenly have an enormous surplus. And that surplus naturally directs itself outward, toward others, toward the world, toward the alleviation of the same suffering you went through, because you know what it's like, and you know the way through. This is not savior behavior. This is not martyrdom. This is the natural expression of a psyche that is no longer at war with itself, and therefore has energy available for something beyond survival. Jung believed this impulse was not incidental. He believed it was the self's ultimate purpose, to individuate not for personal gratification, but so that consciousness itself could expand, so that there would be one more person in the world who was awake, one more person who had withdrawn their projections, owned their shadow, and stopped contributing to the collective unconsciousness that creates so much of the world's suffering. One more person who was real. This is the last piece, and it's the one that transforms individuation from a personal project into something that matters far beyond your own life. Jung was insistent, almost severe, on this point. He said that individuation is not a luxury, it is a moral responsibility. Here's why. An unconscious person doesn't just suffer privately, they spread their unconsciousness. They project their shadow onto their children, who absorb it and carry it as their own wound. They project it onto their colleagues, creating conflicts that have nothing to do with the present and everything to do with unresolved past. They project it onto their political choices, voting from fear, from tribalism, from the unexamined shadow rather than from considered awareness. They project it onto entire groups of people, creating the conditions for prejudice, scapegoating, and collective violence. Jung watched this happen in real time. He watched an entire continent project its shadow onto a single group of people, and he watched the catastrophe that followed. He wrote about it extensively, he warned about it repeatedly, and he traced the root cause not to politics, not to economics, not to ideology, but to the individual unconscious, multiplied by millions. Every person who refuses to face their shadow adds to the collective shadow. Every person who remains identified with their persona contributes to the collective performance that prevents authentic discourse. Every person who projects their anima or animus onto the world instead of integrating it within themselves contributes to the distortion of how we see and treat each other. And conversely, every person who does the work reduces the total weight of unconsciousness in the world. Not metaphorically, practically. A parent who has integrated their shadow does not pass it on to their child. A leader who has faced the night sea journey leads from wholeness rather than from compensated insecurity. A friend who has done the work of individuation can hold space for others without absorbing, rescuing, or projecting. The ripple effect is real, and it can only begin, with the individual. This is why Jung said that the individual is the carrier of civilization's future. Not institutions, not governments, not movements. The individual who has taken responsibility for their own unconscious. That individual is you. If you've made it this far, through every module, every concept, every confrontation, then you already know this. You knew it before you pressed play on this video. You knew it in the ache that brought you here, in the restlessness that wouldn't let you sleep, in the quiet, persistent feeling that your life was waiting for you to show up to it fully. You've been given the map, you've been given the language, you've been given the practices. The only thing left is to live it. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For most of his career, that line was treated as a nice sentiment, an inspirational quote for a poster, something you nod at and then forget while you go back to living the life someone else designed for you. But you know now what that line actually means. It means facing the mask and choosing to remove it, knowing that the people who loved the mask might not love what's underneath. It means descending into your own darkness, not to destroy it, but to retrieve the gold that was buried there when you were too young to fight for it. It means looking at the person who set your heart on fire and asking, with terrifying honesty, am I seeing them, or am I seeing myself? It means surrendering the ego's insistence that it knows best and trusting a deeper intelligence that doesn't explain itself in words. It means sitting in rooms that are too small for you and deciding, quietly, without performance, without apology, to leave. It means becoming someone that no one in your past prepared you to be, and doing it anyway. That is the privilege, and it is earned, not given. Earned through fire, through silence, through the willingness to feel everything you spent your life running from. You didn't find this video by accident. Something in you recognized the call. The same call that has echoed through every mythology, every civilization, every human life that dared to ask the question beneath all questions. Who am I? Really? You now have the tools to answer that. Not in a single sitting, not perfectly, not without setbacks, confusion, and days when the old persona feels like the only safe option, but consistently, honestly, with the knowledge that the path you're on, however solitary it sometimes feels, is the oldest path there is, and that every person who has ever walked it before you is in some way walking beside you now. The map is yours. The descent is yours. The wholeness on the other side, that was always yours. Now go live it.